Hi, I'm Sonia, and this is a class that I term Mycomythology. I haven't heard anybody else use that term, so for now it's mine. Myco meaning mushroom, and then mythology is all things myths and legends, and some spiritual use, some edible use, some just existing in the presence of mushrooms and fungi. So a few things. First, I always like to say right off the bat that my linguistic background, I can speak English, German, Spanish fluently. I speak a very small amount of Old Norse and Samigala. So what that means is that when I run into things, especially in the South American part and the North American part, if I absolutely butcher a pronunciation, I'm just going to blanket apologize right off the bat. I'm trying. So the way I set this lecture up is in a little bit, I'll share my screen, and I have a whole bunch of topics that you can choose from because I can never decide which ones I want to talk about. So I make you people decide that. And you'll be able to just send it in the chat, and hopefully Molly will let me know what pops in. When I pop that screen up, there are several topics that are in like a yellowish orange color. Those are the topics that the predomination of publicly accessible works are about. So, you know, the really common, like if you were to type mushroom myths into Amazon or whatever, those would be the topics that would probably come up the most as they're the most highly publicized. So I like to highlight those just in case you want to delve into the stuff that isn't as popular as far as being published, or you're welcome to have me talk about those ones as well, and then I can kind of give you my spin and my opinion on it. Something to consider when we're talking about the field of ethnomycology in general is that it's not a standalone field. Kind of like, you know, the mycelium of a fungus is made of many, many threads. Ethnomycology has to be that way too. We can't just look at mycology and anthropology. We have to delve a little bit further into that and also look at, you know, religion, spirituality, linguistics, looking at history from different angles and different perspectives, and in general having just this interdisciplinary cooperation is really important. So on several of these, it actually takes me a minute to get to the mushroom part because I need to set you up with a bit of a background for it. So there are fungi involved in all of them. Just be a little bit patient on some of them so I can set that up. So what I will do is have you all select a topic, and then I will go through what I have on that topic, and then I will open the chat to questions for that topic, and then we can jump to a new topic if that works for everybody. Does anyone have any questions right off the bat? Nope. All right. So I will share my screen. Okay. So you should be seeing a PowerPoint thing up. All right, so you can choose from these. Again, the yellowish ones are ones that are more easily accessible to the general public. Oh, I should show you, first of all. Okay, we can still see this. This is the Conspectus of World Ethnomycology by Frank Dugan. And this book is invaluable to me. This has all sorts of links, not links, but you know, it's basically bibliography of scholarly articles and other, you know, lesser known published works. And this is how I find a ton of my material, because you can also go to those works and then go to their works cited and then follow that. But it's a lot of reading. It's a whole lot of reading and chasing down these sources. So that if you want to delve for yourself and see what you can find in this field, that book is an absolute must-have. All right, so which one would you like to start with? I gotta find the chat. Hold on, there we go. Okay. The Norse is the first one. Okay, That one has a soft spot in my heart. Hold on, I have to find my notes for it. So I guess as a point of interest about me, I have a very fond connection to the Norse pantheon. It's in Norse mythology. So I very much went into this with the intention of battling my own confirmation bias, because I really wanted the mushrooms and the Norse to line up, and they actually don't that well. So this is one of those ones that my set on this is to dispel some common rumors, but then I also have a theory at the end of it. So the Norse actually get brought up a lot when talking about mushroom usage, and as far as entheogenic, which means it means invoking the divine, is what entheogenic would mean. And usually it gets brought up with the term berserkers, and berserkers are supposedly these crazy warriors that get so hyped up and so amped up that they can even hurt people around them. And they're pretty famous in the modern Norse discussions and modern Norse sphere, but they're actually, if you actually look at the Icelandic sagas and look at the Eddas, the berserkers don't make much of an appearance, to the point that they probably weren't really a thing and were probably more of a conglomeration of old legends of the Celtic warriors versus the Romans, or old Germanic warriors, things like that. So they're usually depicted, when they are depicted in the Icelandic sagas, as roving bands of criminals, and there is almost always 12 of them, and they're impervious to iron, fire, and steel. All of those things are used very commonly as an anti-Christ motif, or as an anti-apostles motif, or a demonic kind of situation. And the Icelandic sagas were written predominantly during the conversion of Iceland. So it was predominantly being written by Christian monks. So they would use these berserkers as the anti-heroes, so as more of as a literary device than as actual history. The actual word itself, the word bear just like our word, can either mean bear skin or bear animal. And then Zerker means shirt. So it's either they're wearing bear skins, which would denote like a shape-shifting kind of, or more of a animistic kind of thing, or they're have no shirts, which is also if you go back to the old Germanic tribes and the old Celtic tribes would often fight without armor to prove that they were more powerful. I don't know which translation I like better, because there's also a set of warriors called the Ulfenjar that are wolf shirts, so it very well could be bear rar instead of bear naked. So the general thought with most Norse scholars right now is that they are a literary device more than anything else, but they could have been an actual sect that was hunted into extinction. That is a possibility too. So again, their most common thing is that berserker rage. And one of the things that they are called in the Icelandic saga is Odin's men, and Odin is a god of war. So, that rage could very well just be good old fashioned holy fervor, really amping themselves up through breathing and things like that, not necessarily the use of any kind of entheogenic. Where the mushrooms jump in is in 1784. So we're talking quite a long time after the berserkers were supposed to have wandered Iceland, that there was a priest by the name of Odin, and he proposed that Amanita muscaria, which is the Super Mario mushroom, the red with the white patches on it, that's going to be a main character in this whole talk, is Amanita muscaria. He proposed that the berserkers consumed this Amanita muscaria to induce that rage and to induce they couldn't feel pain and things like that. This was most likely from stories of the Rus and the Siberian shamans who did use Amanita entheogenically. That's been proven. It is important to note that Odin had no personal experience or firsthand observations of the effects of Amanita muscaria on people. So the important thing to remember about Amanita muscaria is that the effects of it can be really fickle. Even mushrooms from the same fungal organism, the same, parent fungus, can have different effects and different intensities of effects, and they'll affect different people differently. It's not like the psilocybin mushrooms that have a pretty, if you take a certain gram amount, it's going to have a pretty predictable response. Some strains will be more powerful than others. Amanita muscaria is really unpredictable. And sometimes it creates strength and endurance and excitement, but then sometimes it creates almost apathetic levels of contentment where you're just fine and you just want to sit there. So that unpredictability is not great in any sort of military usage. So that would be weird to use that. But then the question is, how much of that trip, that experience, can be informed by set and setting? So maybe taking the Amanita muscaria with the intention of inducing a battle rage could in fact have done that. So there is no evidence in the Eddas or in the sagas of the Norse using mushrooms as anything other than food. So there's we don't have any written account of them physically using it. It doesn't show up in their poetry or anything like that, which is weird because there's a lot of poetry, and it's very descriptive. I've read a few people trying to get on the bandwagon that Mjolnir, Thor's hammer, could be a mushroom because it has a very short handle, and so it could be a stock. That's not a thing because even the myth explains why the handle is short. So it's from usage to creation. It's definitely a hammer. So if somebody mentions that, that's not a thing. But there is a fungus called Claviceps purpurea, also called ergot, and this is another main character, that it does and can induce some really intense emotions. It is a hallucinogenic fungi that grows on cereal grains. Right here, it's growing on some rye. And it looks really tiny, but it packs a punch. It is actually, this is where the origin of LSD lies, is with this fungus, the acids in this fungus. So it triggers emotional extremes, and then also intense, sometimes threatening visual hallucinations. So you would have that emotional extreme and you're being threatened, so it would evoke a more violent response. It also decreases impulse control and is used as a muscle stimulant. Actually, ancient midwives used to use it to stimulate uterine contractions, but it really gets your muscles amped up and going. So this one again is set and setting may have had deciding factor into how people reacted to it, because when it was used by the Greeks in Eleusis, they were praying to a harvest goddess, and it was about life and death and harmony and balance. So it usually evoked a religious ecstasy. But if you were a warrior type society that was using it as an invocation of a war god, then perhaps it could have induced the kind of rage and fervor that you see in the Germanic and the Celtic tribes and in the stories of the berserkers. The other interesting thing about this is that, again, they don't talk about eating mushrooms anywhere in the sagas or the Eddas, but they do talk about drinking a lot. There's a lot of drinking. And the effects of this fungus would actually survive the fermentation process in the grains. So it would be possible to have a spiked mead or well, not mead, but spiked ale or beer with this in it. So that's the Norse. There's kind of a big question mark in the Norse. Mostly it points to they didn't have a tradition of spiritual mushroom use at all, but if they did, this would probably be the closest theory. Were there any questions about the Norse? ergotamine tartrate used to be one of the few treatments for bad migraines. I did not know that. Thank you for that. That's cool. That's really excellent. All right. Any questions on the Norse before we move to Africa? All right. All set. Okay, hold on. Africa is one of my favorite ones to talk about, and it doesn't get asked about enough. Sometimes it gets skipped over. I really like to use my platform to be able to respectfully display stories that don't get talked about. I'm really sensitive to stories when they're not my culture stories, that I really want to try to get them right. And if I don't, and you know about it, you let me know, and I will look into my stuff. So a lot of the African stories have a lot to do with usage, and so there's different reasons we have myths, right? Sometimes they explain phenomenon, sometimes they warn us against things, and sometimes they teach us about something or encourage us to use something. So you can find a little bit of all of that in the African mythologies. And again, remember, Africa is huge, so there are many different peoples and many different mythologies, and so also variants of the same story and some completely opposite stories for the same topic, and it's really a fascinating place to learn about. The African stories suffer from a similar fate that the indigenous American stories have witnessed, that the stories of the Reindeer people have witnessed, just that with colonization came some holes in the passing on of these cultures, and some of it is skewed by outside perspective and things like that. So the stories I want to relate from this are as close to the people, coming from the people, as humanly possible. So the first place I want to go is West Africa, to the Yoruba people. The Yoruba people are they're made of many different tribes, and the Yoruba is just the overarching nation of people, kind of like the Sami tribes have many different tribes within them. So the Yoruban people have a very strong practice of mushroom harvest, both for edibility and for medicine. And so they tend to use these myths and stories to teach about the mushrooms. So my favorite mushroom myth is, it starts with a woman named Oran, and she has no children. So she prayed to Orunmila, who is the spirit of wisdom and prophecy. And he told Oran that she must appease the gods with the sacrifice. The sacrifice had to include 16 chameleons, 16 fowls, and a large amount of maize and grains. That didn't specify, because he said the number of grains would be the number of children that you would get. So Oran made the sacrifice, and Orunmila provided a white cloth to put over the sacrifice, and to cover the newborn offspring. So then, I don't know why this wasn't brought up to begin with, but then he told Oran that, you need a second sacrifice to make sure that the children don't become food for people and for other creatures. And for reasons untold, Oran said, no, I'm good, and didn't provide that second sacrifice. So Oran's children are called the Oluoran, which means the children of Oran, and they are tiny little white mushrooms. And they are these, the Termitomyces microcarpus, which means little termite mushrooms, because they do grow on termite mounds. And it is said that the children didn't know their father, so that each individual mushroom looks like the first person that it sees. So you see like short plump mushrooms and tall skinny ones, and they're supposed to look like the first person that the mushroom sees. And these are very well used edible mushroom for the Yoruban people. So that story tells you that these white blankets, because they look like a white blanket over the termite mounds, that those are safe for consumption. So that is an example of a myth being used to encourage the uses of mushroom. I did find one people in the Congolese jungles that their creation myth actually is a mushroom. It's both a mushroom and the Great Mother. her name is Allencock, and her upper half, which is the cap, became the dome of the sky. And then the stipe and everything else became the lower part of the earth where people and everything live. But for the most part, rather than being deities, mushrooms are sort of woven in as characters or plot devices. There isn't really like a strong mushroom worship sort of situation going on, except again in a few isolated areas. So another mushroom story that I really like from Nigeria this time is the mushroom baby. And there is a childless chief and his wife, and they want kids like you do. And the wife was hungry and went out hunting for mushrooms. And she found a little baby out when she was, hunting for mushrooms, and she brought the baby home, and they were happy for years. But they had to feed this mushroom baby very special food. It didn't state what that food was, but they had to feed this baby very special food. At some point, an unsavory character comes into the tale, and he steals the mushroom child's food. And the child misses a meal and gets cranky and runs off into the woods and turns into mushrooms again. My thought on this was that it might be a cultivation story about mushrooms, because if you go out and you get the mycelium, the actual growing organism of the mushroom, and you bring it back, in some cases, some don't work, but you bring it back and you make sure it has the right nutrients and the right area to be in, everything like that, you can grow these wild strains of mushrooms at home, and then you don't have to go out foraging into the woods. They're there for you. So that was my thought, was that perhaps this was a tale to encourage the farming of wild mushrooms. And actually in Nigeria, mushroom farming is a thriving industry. They're very into farming and using mushrooms. So I find that interesting. Another story comes out of Cameroon, and this one is just mushrooms are in the story as mushrooms. And I like these because it indicates that in this culture, mushrooms are just food. They're a tool. They're not something mystical and dangerous and something to be afraid of. They're just like a plant. They're just, they're something that we can use or not use or whatever. So in this one, the tortoise is eating his favorite meal, which are mushrooms, and he gets interrupted by the hyena, who is picking on him and annoying him. And the leopard comes to save him, and the tortoise bestows beauty upon the leopard because he was kind, and ugliness on the hyena because he was rude. So this one is, the mushrooms don't play a big role in it, except I like to look at it because, again, they're just being used for what you would use mushrooms for. And it takes away a little bit of, in our culture in America, we tend to have a lot of mycophobia, which is being afraid of mushrooms. You tell kids, don't ever touch a mushroom, which it's fine if your kids touch mushrooms, just don't eat them. You can touch any mushroom you want. We're taught to be very afraid, not just respectful and careful, but actually afraid of mushrooms. And that's not the case in the predomination of indigenous cultures on the planet. They're not afraid of mushrooms, they're respectful of them. Another kind of cool little tidbit comes from the Kalahari, the Khoisan people. And there are these things called desert truffles, which are these weird, wrinkly looking egg things. I should have put a picture up, but I didn't grab it. And they are said to be the eggs of the lightning bird. So in that, we're seeing mushrooms as a gift, being bestowed from the heavens by the lightning bird, which is comparable to the thunderbird of North America. So, this great supernatural creature is bestowing the gift of these desert truffles, which actually, the Khoisan people do use the desert truffles as food and medicine. So all of these indicate, again, that mushrooms are valuable tools and nutrition for these people, and they're woven into their everyday life. To have the mushrooms keep popping up in stories like that. There is one story that really pops out that really shows a gratitude towards fungi. And it's, again, a Yoruban story. So in this story, the Ifanalaya tribe is running from another tribe that were going to go to war with them, and they didn't want to have that. So they were fleeing from them, and they got to this fork in the road, and they, asked the forest spirits, where do we go? Which way do we go? And the mushrooms popped up and said, hi, go this way. So they went that way. And then after the people got through the path, the mushrooms came up and grew in behind them, so that the opposing tribe got to that fork, and they said, well, obviously they couldn't have gone this way because the mushrooms would be all squished, so they went the other way, and so that Ifanale of people managed to get away. And to this day, they do not eat that species of mushroom. I couldn't find what species it was, though, to know if it was a toxic one or not, because that would have been interesting. But they stay away from that particular mushroom. And sometimes that happens, that details get sort of lost and left out because of who's asking, and because of the sacredness of that particular bit of information. It might not be so freely divulged. So another one we have to touch on with Africa, which, by the way, yes, I know Egypt's in Africa, but it has its own thing, so it gets its own little section. But this is from the Tassili Plateau in Algeria. So these are pretty famous now with people who are interested in ethnomycology. I even have a T-shirt of the bee shaman and all that. So this cave system has paintings and petroglyphs, which are carved rock art, dating back between 6,000 and 9,000 BCE, and they were discovered in 1910 by a goat herder. Goats and sheep discover the coolest stuff because they always, their shepherds always give them shelters in caves. And these cave systems have been used on these migratory routes of these migratory herders for a super long time. Back to when people first started recording their history. So sheep and goats know where cool stuff are, so you should follow them around. Currently, this area is in the Saharan Desert, but the Saharan Desert wasn't always the Saharan Desert. It used to be, pretty abundant with game and with plants and fungi and all that. So there's hundreds of scenes in this cave system, hundreds of them. In the idea of adoration and gratitude and harvest and offering is pretty much what the whole cave system is decorated with. It's a very celebratory kind of place and a very grateful kind of place. There are recurring motifs of mushrooms in here, and the most famous is the bee shaman, that little guy who looks like he's got a bee on his face. So mushrooms at this time, and actually now, are capable of being preserved in honey, and at this time it was quite common practice to preserve them in jars of honey so you can take them around with you, because mushrooms, if you've handled them at all, like within 2 days in your fridge and they're funky. So finding a way to preserve mushrooms is really, really important, and honey played a big role in that, and being able to preserve them and being able to carry them around. Another interesting fact is that bees use secretions from the mycelium of many species of fungi as possibly medicine, but definitely a place where they can get certain nutrients and minerals. That's Paul Stamets is pretty active in investigating that phenomenon in North America. So the bees and the mushrooms kind of work together. Also, it should be noted that psilocybin mushrooms, which are the most common hallucinogenic mushroom, if they are in honey, they will actually make the honey psychoactive as well. So that could be another reason that we have what appears to be, or what could be, there's a lot of mushrooms that look like that, but what could be psilocybin mushrooms in his hands and all over him, along with that bee and honey motif. So the second scene, I really like this one. It's really hard to see and it's really hard to get a good picture of, but these little guys here are the mushroom runners. So they have little mushroom caps on their heads, and you can see they're holding a mushroom, and they actually have these lines between their mushrooms going to their heads, going to their brains. So it kind of, it appears to convey something going between the mushroom and the human brain. Like theoretically they're humans. So it's thought to depict some sort of ritual and perhaps some sort of like a Olympic Games kind of thing where you're using your physical prowess to display the greatness of your deity, perhaps something like that. Obviously, we don't have any written or personal records from this culture, So we're just kind of playing fan fiction with human art, which happens a lot when you get way back into history. Is you kind of, at some point, you have to make an interpretation. This is one of those points where you have to just kind of make an interpretation and see what fits. And that's where we use the interdisciplinary studies of what would make the most sense for this time period, for this area, for humans in general. It should be noted that when humans first started putting art on rocks and things, that they didn't just, it wasn't like an Instagram selfie, we can take a million pictures a minute now. These were important. They were repeated rituals or repeated events, things that happened often, or things that were of great significance, like calamitous significance. So if it's on a rock, it's important. It is something worth taking a look at. The other thing that appears in the Tassili caves is this anthropomorphology. Wow, yeah, nope, can't say that word. So animals with human parts, or humans with animal parts, or animals turning into humans, or humans turning into animals. And that happens a lot in these paintings, and most often it's ruminants that they're turning into. And this is also a very theorized origin of why cows and cattle, of one of the reasons, there's a lot of reasons, one of the reasons cows and cattle are considered, are deified in some cultures. And that's because these spores of fungi, and especially most famously the psilocybe genus, can be passed through into their dung, and they can actually grow in the dung of these cattle and other ruminants. So the research and press have really focused on the Tassili Plateau, but in this, they found the same style of art in Libya, Chad, Egypt, and Southern Europe. So it actually really suggests a pretty wide area of this entheogenic mushroom use. And this is our earliest recorded suggested use of mushrooms as an entheogen, not just as a as medicine or tool or edible or something like that. All right, any questions on the Africa section? Yes, that is the spelling. Yep. All right, if we don't have any questions, I will scroll up and find the next section we wanted to talk about. The reindeer people. Thank you for typing that. That's my favorite one. So the reindeer people section, it encompasses both very northern Scandinavia with the Sami people, and also Siberia, the Siberian, northern Siberia. There were also reindeer herders / are still a few in northern Mongolia as well. But I think it's really important to note that reindeer culture, reindeer in general, have a much bigger geography than we seem to realize right now. Actually, I've done talks where people actually asked me if reindeer were real. It really makes me sad, but yeah, it's reindeer are real, and they're incredibly important to human history. So my personal cultural background on my mom's side, my mom's dad's side, is Finn and Swedish. So we have reindeer culture in our background. Also, super secretly, my farm was originally built to have reindeer, and we decided against it for a few years, but we're trying to do it again. We're thinking about it, so stay tuned for that. But this particular area of study is really important to me, so much that I got it tattooed on my arm. Can't see it, yeah. So I got those petroglyphs tattooed on my arm because they are that important, and they really inspired me. This is the region that inspired me to look deeper at mycomythology and to look deeper at how mushrooms have shaped humanity, and then also how the reindeer have as well. So again, reindeer culture, they've discovered reindeer bones and other depictions of reindeer as far south as southern Spain. And then the farthest south we know of a reindeer mythology is the Cyrenian hind of the Greek mythology, because that's not Demeter, I'm sorry, Artemis's deer, who is a female who has antlers and who pulls things, and that is most definitely a reindeer. So there is talk about reindeer and their powers as far south as Greece. Also, reindeer did, in fact, used to be in North America as well, much more predominantly. Now we just have the caribou, who are so closely related to reindeer that they can produce viable, breedable offspring. So this is another one of those. It's going to take a minute to get the mushrooms, but I'm getting there. In 1965, a geologist by the name of Samurokov, Samurokov, was conducting a geological survey along the Petroglyphs River in Russia. It's very north and very east in Russia. And he discovered these rock engravings along the Petroglyphs River. He sent these photos to his friend, who was an archaeologist, so that was convenient, by the name of Nikolai Dikov. So excavations of this area began in 1967, and so far they've discovered 104 petroglyphs. And they don't just mean individual petroglyphs, like this whole like splotch here would be considered one petroglyph. So 104 petroglyphs, and the dig site right now is a little over a mile long. So this was a very well-used channel at some point. This was an important place. Again, if it's on a rock, it's important. They have lots of the pictures depict life in general of this area, and they depict hunting and reindeer. It was the main source of what they hunted, and it originally became a sacred, or it eventually became a sacred animal, as well as one of humanity's first herd animals. Because the way they hunted, they would actually funnel the herds in. They had a wide area that narrowed out into a bottleneck, and they'd funnel the herds in through that, and so they would be all herded together. And that's how humanity started herding animals. They did the same to cattle and sheep and everything else. So these pictures also depict dogs and people, but most interestingly, they have these mushroom-headed figures. And if you look at the mushrooms that are depicted, it's the closest thing with the, you see there's a cap here, as well as the annulus, or that little skirt that goes around some mushrooms, is the Amanita muscaria again. So this is indicating perhaps another usage of the Amanita muscaria. They are, you can tell there are female and male figures. The females are almost always larger and almost always have this double mushroom. See, he's got a mushroom shaped head, but he doesn't have the mushroom above him as well. So this might indicate a strong female shamanic practice, which is accurate to these people, that females were the original shamanic practitioners. So again, it's said that the mushroom that is depicted is the Amanita muscaria, which is the red cap and the white patches. It is mycorrhizal, which means that it forms a relationship with certain trees or certain plants. And this one is mycorrhizal to birch and fir, which are, you know, the predominant trees in this area. The theory behind what is going on in this picture, especially also this one, is that this is a hunt preparation scene. So what would happen would be the shamanist would you know, take the mushroom and then use the mushroom to quote unquote fly. In this region, the shamanic tradition is that shamans would go in kind of an astral projection and would fly to the answers they were finding, or the people, or whatever it was they were finding. So, you know, in this, the shamans would be sending their psyche out to find the reindeer herds for a successful hunt. So the question would be, why would they use Amanita muscaria for that? And that is because reindeer absolutely love mushrooms, and they particularly love Amanita muscaria. They will, in fact, fight each other over Amanita muscaria. It's not known whether they experience psychedelic effects or not, or whether their digestive tract, you know, just works different, or their body works different, and they don't. But what we do know is that the psychedelic components of Amanita muscaria can actually be secreted in urine, so that the urine of the animal or the person who ingested this mushroom would be psychoactive. I bring this up because it might be an indication of how they first found that out, because there is a tradition in some societies for the drinking of urine of shamans who have ingested Amanita muscaria. The way they would have gotten to that would be in these animist type religions where the animals are very sacred, and they're very respected. The idea is to become the animal that you are hunting so that you can better understand it and you can better respect it. So reindeer, one of the things they do when they're in rut is they will actually lick the urine of the cow reindeer, the bulls will. So that may be, emulating that may have been how it was discovered that the urine was also psychoactive. But just beyond that, ingesting some of the Amanita muscaria that the reindeer were ingesting would make the hunter more like the reindeer. So that would be how humans first discovered that these did something to their brains and to their psyches. So there's a long tradition in both northern Scandinavia and Siberia of the Amanita muscaria being used for entheogenic purposes, being used in ceremony and ritual and things like that. But it's really important to note that the strongest shamans, the ones that were considered the strongest, did not have to use anything like that. This was considered a tool to try to help open that gateway. It wasn't something they did over and over and over and over and over again. I've heard some talk about it being used in a communal aspect, which far back, there's some evidence of that, but mostly it seemed to be the shamans themselves using it rather than the whole community. But here, this far back, this was the Neolithic era. Obviously, something was going on mushroom-wise with the whole community. So at some point, it was a community event, but in the more, I don't want to say modern, because there isn't a super strong shamanic practice modernly. There is some, but not as strong as it was. But within the I guess European written anthropological history, the university histories, within university histories, the Amanita muscaria was not used communally. It was used very specifically, but apparently, according to this, it was used communally at some point, which has led some mushroom enthusiasts and some ethnomycologists to make some theories / assumptions on how people would ingest these. So the first thing is that usually dry caps are used. It makes them slightly safer. Please don't go dry Amanita muscaria caps and eat them, because I said that. Always be careful. But the dry caps seem to be, it both makes the psychoactive component more bioavailable, and it allows, it decreases the risk of liver damage. So this is one of the things I ran into, was that, the red balls on the Christmas tree are because the people used to hang Amanita muscaria caps in the trees. No, they didn't, because A, it's very cold and they wouldn't dry, and B, the reindeer would eat them right off the trees. So that one I'm going to debunk right there. So there's a few of those that I ran into. Actually, the first lecture about ethnomycology I went to, the speaker went into kind of a very dramatic retelling of how shamans would creep over the snow because the only thing you could see was the smoke hole in the homes, and how the shamans would creep over the snow and drop down and deliver Amanita muscaria, being, then that would be the origin of Santa Claus. Coming from a heavily snow-laden area, we know that sometimes our doors do get a little stuck in, but we don't go out our chimneys. We handle it, and that's the same way. The way the housing was positioned was very intelligent and very thought out for predominant wind direction and predominant snowfall, and so people could still get out their doors. That's a weird thing to say. That was, I don't know, kind of infantilizes the culture a little bit, and so that one kind of bugged me. And that was a big impetus. That story in particular was a big impetus for me myself to go out and find my own information, because I wasn't sure about that. I wanted to see what was up with that. So again, when you're going to any sort of lecture, it's all somebody's opinion at the end of the day. Well-researched opinions, yes, but somebody's opinion. So take what they say and use that to, use that as a springboard and go your own direction with it. That's my little life lesson today. So that is the origin of this idea of mushroom entheogenic use in reindeer herding people, which then slides into this fellow right there. Hide the children. All right. Spoiler alert for Santa Claus. Every year around this time, I get tagged and sent so many articles about mushroom Santa, which I'm fine with because it means people are, engaging with me and they want to share, and that's super cool, and I love that. But I will say that I'll frequently come back and email them, links about the struggles of reindeer herders and the struggles of the reindeer herding people that are kind of getting swept under the rug or haven't been publicized or talked about. So I tend to use that platform to educate people about the cultures that they're trying to portray with that kind of thing, the cultures that are being invoked in these really hastily written articles. The biggest thing that gets brought up when comparing Santa Claus to a mushroom is the red and white, the Amanita muscaria. Red and white is a really common color scheme, and a lot of ethnomycologists get caught in that trap of anytime red and white pops up, it has to be Amanita muscaria. But it doesn't, because red and white, like candy canes, are supposed to be, the purity of Jesus, and then the red is the blood. In other cultures, white is the color of death and red is the color of life because it's blood. Usually red is blood. But so there's a lot of red and white. It's not necessarily the Amanita muscaria. However, there are some Siberian tribes where they're especially the female shamans do wear red with white spots. That one, like circular polka dots. So that one would make me sit up and take notice and say, hey, no, that really does look like the Amanita muscaria can be involved in that. But just having something be red and white is not enough. And there is actually a reason that Santa Claus is red and white, and it came about in 1931. Before that, Santa Claus was usually depicted in earthy tones, in browns and greens and things like that. Occasionally blue. But generally more toned down attire. So again, Santa isn't totally derived from Sami or Siberian culture, but he borrows a lot from it. There's Santa origin stories in the Norse, Germanic, Celtic, Greek, all sorts of places. So I think everybody can have a little piece of Santa Claus and can claim a little bit of the origin of Santa Claus. It should be noted that the first reindeer appearance wasn't until 1821. That was the first time Santa was depicted with reindeer. Before that, it was horses, a goat, a boar in one, a creepy little guy who followed him around and did things to bad children. So reindeer were not always the Santa Claus's buddies. Another thing to possibly consider when we're talking about Santa Claus mythology are the elves. And it has been theorized that the elves are actually supposed to be a depiction of the Sami people in kind of an infantilized state. So that's something to be careful of and something to look at and maybe just think about it. I don't want to sway you either way on that because I'm not really sold on that theory, but just something to think about. So when Santa did turn red and white was in 1931, and it was a Swede-Finn American by the name of Haddon Sundblom who drew him for the Coca-Cola Company. So the reason our Santa Claus is red and white is because of capitalism and because of Coca-Cola. So again, you can't just see red and white and think Amanita muscaria, because there's a reason Santa is red and white, and it has nothing to do with mushrooms. I like to bring up my other catchphrase, which is the Transylvania effect. So when I say Transylvania, people automatically think Dracula. But if you actually look at Transylvania, there's an amazing culture there with stunning embroidery, amazing dance, great food, incredible music. But because of modern mythologies and modern popularity, the only thing people think is vampire. So when you bring up reindeer, the only thing people think is Santa Claus right off the bat. But it's really, really important that we understand that there are living cultures that need to have attention paid to them, that need to be looked at and talked about. And honestly, in our region in northern Wisconsin and northern Minnesota, there are a lot of, you know, direct genetic connections there. So it's a little bit more common for us to understand that reindeer and these mushrooms and things are culturally sacred and not just a marketing tool. So that's my little soapbox spiel on that one. Does anyone have any question about the reindeer people section? Nothing? Okay. I think next we were going to North America. For some reason, the North America one is the one I get requested the absolute least, but it's really cool. Because we get to talk about all sorts of things. That's Mesoamerica, that's not North America. So this is another topic where there are gaps in the knowledge, and there are several reasons for that. For one thing, it really depends on who was doing the research for what, and who decided what was important to record. So there's Professor Robert Blanchette of the Plant Pathology Department at the University of Minnesota, who I discovered a interview with him, and he pointed out that early scholars were really unfamiliar with mycology due to our mycophobic culture in Western European and in the colonized American cultures, is that there was this, you know, there's this instilled fear of mushrooms. So they didn't even think to ask about mushroom usage, about fungal usage. So, you know, when they interviewed elders who we since lost due to, you know, often horrific circumstances, we lost a lot of that, just plain lost it, and aren't going to be able to recover it. And then there's also, again, that apprehension culturally that talking about something sacred, you know, like potential entheogenic mushroom use, would have been difficult to do for the people who were being interviewed, who were being talked about. So there are gaps there. But now that hopefully society is being a little bit more cognizant of that, we're being able to uncover it, you know, and bring some of these stories to light, which is really good. A very central character to that, the person to that movement is Kiwi-Dinakwe Pakawakuk-Pashel, and she was born in 1919 and she just died in 1999. She was born to the Anishinaabe Crane clan in Michigan, and she apprenticed with wise women and elder. I'm so sorry, I'm going to make this so wrong. Nojimakwe from the age of 9. So Kiwi-Dinakwe began her herbalism journey at the age of 9, which is pretty cool. Her name means woman of the northwest wind, and she recognized her people's need for treatment and for medicine, and for culturally applicable medicine, you know, to use the medicines of their people, to use the plants that they have used for millennia and the fungi they've used for millennia. She recognized a great need in that. So she began treating her friends and family and neighbors and everything. And she actually got a letter from the AMA threatening prosecution if she continued unlicensed midwifery at one point, which she just kept doing it anyways, because she believed that was what was right for her people, and she wanted to be able to provide them with you know, culturally appropriate medicine. She believed in teaching everyone, and she believed in using stories and myths because it helped people remember. And that resonates with me. You're going to remember something that you're entertained by because it evokes emotion. So if you can evoke emotion in somebody while you're teaching, they're going to remember things a lot better. Well, let me check the chat real quick. Yeah, thank you. Okay, so Kiwi-Dinakwe also controversially taught non-Indigenous people as well. And what she had to say about that was, it is well past time for people with good hearts and like minds to work together for this planet. which I really, that resonates with me as well. She founded the Minniskittigan Drum, which is an organization dedicated to teaching and maintaining the knowledge of the Anishinaabe people. At the age of 57, she decided that people, meaning universities and scholars and such, would take her more seriously if she had a degree. So at the age of 57, she began studying anthropology. She got a master's of education from Wayne State University, and she finished the work for her PhD in ethnobotany from the University of Michigan, but she never actually obtained her PhD because she failed the German proficiency test. That was the only reason that she didn't get her full degree, which is, yeah. So she was not allowed to take the preliminary exams or write her dissertation because she failed the German test. So that's kind of something to think about. She went on, though, to teach ethnobotany and philosophy of the Great Lakes American Indians at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. For a very, very long time, and still somewhat today, ethnobotanists, not ethnomycologists, ethnobotanists contended that the Anishinaabe people did not use mushrooms at all, like for anything. That is really difficult to believe. As an ethnomycologist, that's difficult to believe because mushrooms are a very excellent, protein source, and one that doesn't require a lot of energy output to obtain it. So that would be a very valuable food source. And not to mention, there is usages of mushrooms that we can find in our backyard, chaga and birch polypore, things like that, usages of them nearly circumpolar, but then we're supposed to believe that just in North America they didn't use them, these same funguses. I don't think that's not a thing. So in 1978, Kiwi Dinquay published Papoi for the People, which is a narrative account of some uses of fungi among the Anishinaabe. So she wanted to make sure that this knowledge that she knew her people had wasn't lost because, non-indigenous ethnobotanists said it wasn't a thing. So the word Papoi means swells up in stature suddenly and silently from an unseen source of power. The word itself isn't necessarily only for fungi, but it definitely, fits fungi. She also wrote Mosquito, which was set during the foundation of the Anishinaabe people. And this is a story or a legend about the use of Amanita muscaria. It has been contested by people for a few reasons. By people, I mean predominantly white male scientists, question mark, some of them weren't scientists, some of them were, that there's a few things. First of all, again, they really tried to drive home that there was no use of any fungi, which, again, I don't really believe that. Also, that she describes Mosquito or the Amanita muscaria as red capped with white spots. And in our area, Amanita muscaria is we have the variation Gasoii, which is like an orangish. It can be anywhere from yellow to deep orange. So the thought on that was that this is actually a story from very, very long ago, from when perhaps the tribes moved from an area with the red Amanita muscaria into this area, or that the Amanita muscaria itself may have once been red because there isn't really a huge difference between our orange and yellow versions and the red versions, which you can find, in the Rockies and in southern, a little bit more south. So predominantly eastern area of North America has the yellowish orange and the western has red, but there's not a huge difference between the varieties. So this story, Mosquito, again, it was set with the very founding of the Anishinaabe people. And it begins with two young brothers that were hunting in the mountains. So again, obviously it's going to be either from a different place or from so long ago that places like the Pinocchio Mountains that I live in were still mountainous. They came to a great cave and there was a light and sound inside and a buzzing sound like the humming of uncountable bees, which is kind of cool because it brings back our friend the bee shaman into a mushroom story, which is kind of neat. And they peeped inside of the cave and there was a meadow of murmuring mushrooms who were all spinning and dancing and humming. And they were all Amanita muscaria, and there was a bright light in this cave like sunlight, which is another cool crossover because many legends and myths of Omnimuscaria, and it used fire or the sun or something like that to evoke the image of the mushroom. So the younger brother leapt right through this cave opening, and the elder brother was like, no, dude, stop. But the younger brother didn't listen, because younger siblings don't. And he ran to the biggest and tallest mushroom. And as he touched this huge mushroom, little brother became a mushroom. He shrunk down and became a mushroom. So this obviously, concerned the older brother, and he went running to go talk to the elders and the medicine people. And he's like, this is what happened. I need to get my brother back. What do we do? So the elders said they'd never heard of anything like that. So they consulted the drum. And when they came back from the consultation, they told the older brother about a journey that he had to take. He had to first retrieve magic sands from a high cliff on a rugged lakeshore and remember to thank the spirits of the sands. Then he must climb into Thunderbird's nest and retrieve 4 feathers and remember to thank Thunderbird. And then he had to go back to the cave in the mushroom. So the elder brother did this. And then when he went back to the cave, he was supposed to put a feather, one of the Thunderbird's feathers, in the biggest mushroom, because that was the chief of the mushroom tribe. And he was supposed to put a feather in the oldest mushroom, because that was the medicine man of the mushroom tribe. And then he was also supposed to stick a feather into his little brother and dump the magic sands over him, and then pick him, but don't break off any part of him, because then little brother will be missing some part of his body if you break off part of him. So he was supposed to pick him and run out of the cave as fast as he could and put the last Thunderbird feather in front of the cave so that it could act as a magical barrier and the mushroom spirits couldn't follow him. He was also not supposed to look back and not stop running until he reached his people again. And the mushroom would start growing, so it would get heavier and heavier and heavier. And he wasn't supposed to look at little brother either. He was just knowing that little brother was coming back by how heavy this mushroom was getting. So he did all that, and then he was also supposed to leave the feather always, forever, in little brother. Always had to have the feather stuck in his skin from then on. So they did all of that, and everyone was good. Life returned to normal. It was fine. But as life went on, the elder brother started becoming chronically sad and chronically worried all the time. And younger brother was always very happy and carefree. So younger brothers would sometimes disappear at night, and elder brother was not certain he liked that, because he was, obviously a little protective after that incident. So one night, elder brother crept out behind little brother and followed him around. And he came to a clearing in the woods where he found younger brother in bright red robes with tufts of white feathers, surrounded by people holding up birch bark containers to catch his urine. So again, we're seeing Omnimuscaria connected with urine and with drinking urine. So it was said that the mosquito spirits contained in the urine made people very happy and very carefree and courageous, and they could do the work of 10 people when they imbibed this drink, which is potentially one of the effects that set of effects that you can get from Omnimuscaria. So now in the world, there are elder brothers who are constantly worried and constantly thinking and planning and concerned. And then there are younger brothers who are happy and carefree and have much knowledge of the supernatural. So that was the story of Mosquito, as written by Kiwadinakwe Pakawaka-Pichel. And again, there are some contestations as to the veracity of that. I will tell you that I have personally met women who were very, very close. One was actually adopted by Kiwadinakwe, and the contestations as to Kiwadinakwe's character made by certain people in the ethnomycological world, in the ethnobotanical world, do not match with what firsthand descriptions are of her. So that's another one that, as you explore her and explore her works, to remember that everything has a bias, and just to be aware of that while you're learning about her. So other mushroom tidbits from North America. For the predomination of North American mycomythology, mushrooms are not deities. They're not seen as gods or anything like that. They're tools and sometimes characters. One of the tool ones is in the northern plains of Canada, the Haploporus odoris, which is a kind of funky smelling bracket mushroom. It grows on the willow, and it is used to stop bleeding, treat dysentery, treat coughs, and then also because of its strong, like anise kind of smell, it's used as an incense and used to carry intentions and energies and prayers and things like that. It was made into necklaces and used in medicine pouches and decorated sacred war robes. Again, this is in the northern plains of Canada. So that's the most common kind of usage of fungi that you can see if you start poking around a little more. This fungal usage, this one isn't necessarily any sort of myth or legend, but I think it's important to talk about. This is Philinus igniaris, which is the ichmic mushroom. And this is sort of, whether it had an actual story attached to it or not isn't really known, but it did have, it has a long history of usage, and often in a ceremonial aspect, because what this does when it's ground down and burned a bit and mixed with other things is the alkaline pH of this fungus affects the enes, so the nicotines, caffeine, morphine, cocaine, codeine, all that gets affected more. You feel the effect more if you mix it with this ichmic, especially that's especially important to think about with nicotine. So the ashes of this mushroom, it's called punk ash when you grind it and you burn it down. They're kept in decorative snuff boxes, and they're considered a status symbol. They're considered, it's important to gift them, and it's important to trade them. And there's a big cultural importance to them in mostly in the Alaskan area. So when the tobacco spread, when tobacco got co-opted from North America, it went first to Spain and then north to Poland and Sweden, and from there it went over to Russia, and from there it went back to North America through Alaska as a recreational use rather than a spiritual use, rather than an important entheogenic use, really. So when the tobacco, which doesn't grow where ichmic grows, or at least not where we're talking about, when it was combined with this ichmic, it became, even more powerful. And usually it was chewed or smoked, either way. But the person who would do the chewing, would do the work of chewing the tobacco and the ichmic together, was the wife. She would start it out, and then once it activated, she would give it to the husband. Currently, over 50% of Yupik women, Yupik people in the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta up in Alaska currently use ichmic in that way, and 80% of pregnant women do. And you can see why that is concerning, given that it enhances effects. So this is kind of a story of when cultural, co-option and as well as intermingling can kind of have dangerous effects, and we need to be, when we're dealing with people's sacred medicines and sacred plants and sacred fungi, we need to have respect behind that when we're talking about them, and when we're potentially utilizing them or advertising their usage. It's something that we need to be very cognizant and very aware of how we do that. The next section in North America I want to talk about, we'll jump down to the Pacific Northwest. And this is another story that's it's bittersweet, but a lot of bitter. So the agaricon mushroom, Fomitopsis officinalis, is it doesn't grow here, but it grows in Pacific Northwest. We have some of its like cousins here. The horsehoof fungus, Fomes fomentarius, is slightly related to it. So it's those hard mushrooms you see on the side of a lot of birch trees. But this is like the big version of that. It's a perennial bracket mushroom, which means it comes back every year and grows a new growth ring. And it can live up to 75 years, and it adds a new layer to itself every year. So the one you can see most readily around here that does that in northern Wisconsin is the Ganoderma applanatum, which is the artist conch, the little big flat ones that have the rings in it, and you can count how old they are, and that's kind of cool. The agaricon mushroom, though, actually has usage dating at least 2,000 years back in Europe. So the Greek pharmacist Dioscorides, he used it to treat tuberculosis. and it is, you know, a pretty powerful medicinal mushroom. There's continued medicinal use. It's been used in pharmaceuticals, or at least studied in pharmaceuticals. To this day, it's still used. And the medicinal compounds are now, they're able to synthesize and manufacture them and put them in certain pharmaceutical drugs, which is, I always love when mushrooms are able to do that. Currently, Paul Stamets, who's arguably probably the most famous mycologist, his research really centers on the agarikon mushroom, and in protecting old growth forests where you can find it, because it was used so heavily in Europe that it's nearly extinct in Europe, but there's still a decent-ish population in the Pacific Northwest. So there's a fungi perfecti article from the November 13th, 2009 issue that's called The Search for Agarikon. So if you're interested in Paul Stamets' work, I would start with that article. So in the indigenous Pacific Northwest, many tribes, including the Tlingit and the Haida, they used the agarikon for or forest fungi in general for medicine, tinder, food, and dye, and as well as spiritual significance. The Pacific Northwest is actually it's really rich in ethnomycological treasures. It's really an important area for ethnomycologists to be looking at, and there's been a lot of co-creation and cooperation between the indigenous people and with modern ethnomycologists who come there respectfully and want to learn about it, not with the intent of changing it, but just to learn about it. That's really important. So usually the mushrooms are used, again, as a tool, especially spiritually, as a tool, not as, you know, a main deity or anything like that. It was said that the tree fungi, the brackets on the trees, are what are responsible for echoes in the woods, because it's not sound waves, it's the mushrooms talking back to you. So the mushrooms are very much considered to have spirit and to have character to them. They could also, certain mushrooms, especially the agarikon, could be used to reflect evil intent back. So the mushrooms were considered defenders and protectors. So they could, they would reflect ill intent back to whoever sent it to you. This mushroom would. The agarikon was called the bread of ghosts by some tribes, and there's a lot of interaction between the other world or the spiritual realm and these mushrooms. And where these mushrooms are, it was kind of considered maybe gateways or ways you could contact, you know, deceased ancestors and all that. So this one has an interesting story. These little figurines here are a really interesting story. In the American Museum of Natural History, they were investigating the deterioration rates of wood art pieces from the Pacific Northwest to see, you know, how do we store these better? How do we date them better, and how do we preserve them? So they were looking at these figurines in particular, and then eventually they're like, wait a minute, this isn't wood. What is this? This is not wood. And it turns out it's they're carved figurines that were collected by G. Emmons, who was an anthropologist from 1880 to 1900 is when he would have found these in Southeast Alaska. He found these at shaman grave sites, at medicine man grave sites. And they have since been found elsewhere. These kind of carved figurines have been found elsewhere in the Pacific Northwest, and even in some masks. And they are carved out of the agarikon mushroom. So they are little mushroom figurines that have been preserved really, really well. They were used during the shaman's life for protection during ceremonies, again, to reflect, you know, bad energy or bad spirits away. And then when the shaman died, they would place these at the head of the grave as spirit catchers to guard the grave. So they weren't supposed to move. They were the guardians of these graves. The thing is that, you know, they should not have been disturbed. They should not have been taken away from where they were, and they should be put back. I will state my opinion pretty harshly on that. But the only reason we know about the importance and about these little things is because somebody moved them. So it's a tricky spot for anthropologists, and I feel like anthropologists, archaeologists really run into that a lot. It's a tricky spot. We're not supposed to have moved this, but since we did, we learned this. So I think at this point, if I had my way, I would take what we've learned from this, ask the living culture about it, and put these back because they were doing a job. They were guarding that particular grave. So some more in the Pacific Northwest. Here we go. If you've heard of Charles Edenshaw, it's important to note that the Edenshaw is actually a title. It's a title of it. It's a chieftain title. So it got anglicized into Edenshaw as his last name, but it's actually an honorary title. This plate that he created is the depiction of Fungus Man and the creation of woman. So this is the Haida creation story, and it starts with Raven, because a lot of things start with Raven, because he gets up to all sorts of things, and you can find it in the stories of Raven traveling. So Raven was up to his tricks and looking for trouble to get into, and he was on a beach and he found a clamshell, and there were legs poking out of the clamshell, and he was like, well, that's not normal. So he opened it up, and out fell humans, the first humans. But the trick was that the females were actually missing their genitalia, so the humans were all extremely depressed because they had no way to reproduce. So Raven was like, okay, we'll fix this. We can fix this. I'll fix this. And first he asked Snowbird to get in the canoe and let's paddle out here to the sacred island. But the trick is it's guarded by these sea serpent dragony type things out here, who are going to destroy the canoe. They're and kill everyone, and they're scary creatures. And Snowbird was like, you know what? No, I'm out. I'm not going to do this. And he ducked out and left. And then I know he asked Eagle, and Eagle almost made it, but then was like, nah, no, we're turning back. And he asked a few other things. He kept asking all the creatures and couldn't find anybody who wanted to go with him to this sacred island to help the humans. So eventually Raven drew a face on the white pore surface of a mushroom on a nearby tree, and it turned into Fungus Man. And Fungus Man, again, the fungi reflect the negative things they protect, and they keep everybody safe from spiritual harm. So Fungus Man ended up steering and paddling the canoe, and then Raven got to the island and collected these magical chitons, which is this weird clammy type thing. Is a chiton. It's a sea creature, but it looks very much like other things. So he brought the sea creature back and stuck it onto the human females, and then they had reproductive organs. So in the Haida mythology, the Fungus Man was very important in creating humanity. And that's the end of my North American section. If anybody has questions on that. Yeah, our local Ganadrons can add multiple rings each year, so counting them is not an exact science for age, but cool to take note of. I think it's the same with the Agaricon, is they can, depending on conditions, they can add multiple ones, but they're fun to watch grow. My kids have like a pet one out in the woods that they're watching. All right. So that was the end of our requested sections. Does anybody want to request more sections? We have some more time. I suppose I should go back to the you don't know what's on here. All right, hold on. There you go. My aunt Jill, hi auntie, says the mysteries, the Eleusidian mysteries. This is one that has been published and talked about a lot, but I like to talk about it too. It's predominantly Greek, also a little bit into the Roman era. But so we're going to start out with a big long story that's going to take a minute for the mushrooms to come up, but they're coming, I swear. And then the witch is next. Yep, I'll do the witches next. I like that one too. Okay, so the Eleusidian mysteries. So in the time period that we're talking about is roughly 1600 BCE to 392 CE. With that, the last date is pretty dead on, because that's when the temple got destroyed. But so 14 miles outside of Athens, at the end of a road called the Sacred Way, there is a temple to Demeter. And Demeter, if you're not familiar, is the harvest, fertility, earth fertility goddess of the Greeks. And she had a daughter who most people call Persephone, but she wasn't Persephone yet. Her daughter was originally Kore, which just means maiden. And in the story, Hades, the lord of the underworld, kidnaps Kore. There's apparently some debate as to whether that was consensual or not. I don't know. But Demeter, the mom was extremely distraught and, searched the earth for her daughter and then neglected her duties as the agricultural and harvest goddess and growing things. And crops died, fields fell, livestock starved. It was just not a good time to be a human. And then eventually she was so exhausted that she collapsed in a well in the city of Eleusis, and she was found by the queen, and the queen made her, or asked, brought her home and cleaned her up because she was disguised as a kind of an old woman. That was one of Demeter's favorite disguises. And she became the nursemaid to the young prince, which was kind of okay for Demeter, but she longed for a divine child to care for. She wanted her daughter back, or at least, a divine child, not a mortal child. So she bathed the infant in fire every night, which this gets hooked around to either Amanita muscaria or the ergot trips, because they both increase body temperature. So that could be where that was in the story. So the queen walked in on this once and understandably was a little bit upset that she was like holding her kid in the fire. That's not, I don't think any of us want to see our babysitters do that. So she was absolutely enraged, and then Demeter was like, wait, and then revealed herself as Demeter the goddess. And then the queen was like, oh, my bad. Thanks for doing what you're doing. And they decided, that she would continue to raise Triptolemus, who was the child. And they provided Demeter with a temple to reside in Eleusis. And Triptolemus became kind of a god, kind of a demigod sort of situation of agriculture, nature, and life and death. So all the things Demeter has kind of got passed on to the son Triptolemus. So meanwhile, though, Zeus, in classic Zeus form, was angry that the humans weren't giving him anything, even though they were starving to death. So he was really upset about that, and eventually went down to his brother Hades and was like, hey, could you possibly return Kore, because Demeter's wreaking havoc up here. And Hades was like, man, I'd love to, but she ate some food, so I can't send her back. And so Zeus told that to Demeter, and Demeter was like, that's ridiculous. How much could she have possibly eaten? And they said that she ate 6 seeds from a pomegranate. And so Hades was like, okay, all right, everybody's mad at me. Here's the deal. We'll send Kore back for 6 months. By the way, her name is Persephone now, which means Queen of the Underworld. So that's what she does now. So we'll send her back for 6 months. She can live with her mom, and for 6 months she lives with me. And that was supposed to explain, the seasons and spring and summer and fall and winter. So this honors the cycle of the seasons, and it also honors the cycle of life and death, and death being a way to provide nutrients and basis for new life and all that. So there were 2 mysteries, which were I guess festival / ritual is a good way to describe what a mystery is. And there was 2 of them that they held in Eleusis. The lesser mystery was in the spring, and the greater mystery was in the fall. You had to be initiated through the lesser spring mysteries to be able to attend the greater mysteries. But these mysteries were open to everybody. Everybody could come, men, women, even slaves. Everybody could come, and when you were there, you were all considered equal. Everybody, there was no, like, if you came there as the king, it didn't matter. You were just like everybody else. So it was presided over by women, entirely by women, the priestesses of Demeter. And there was definitely some kind of entheogenic substance at play in the mysteries. It was called the kykeon, which is an entheogenic drink. It is also currently or later used for a favorite drink of the peasant class, and it was mildly alcoholic. So think kind of like the Egyptian beer, mildly alcoholic, fairly nutrient dense, kind of like liquid bread. The current forerunning theory as to what made the kykeon, the capital K kykeon, entheogenic or hallucinogenic at any rate, is the Claviceps purpurea, again, our funny little grain mushroom, because again, that could be fermented and retain the psychoactive effects in drink form. So in this mystery, the initiates were said to transcend the mortal sphere and commune with the divine. So that right there is the exact definition of entheogenic, is communing with the divine. There's lots of art reliefs and mosaics, and I didn't bring my slide up, or you could have been looking at it the whole time. I'm a professional, folks. All right. Find it. 39. There we go. There's lots of art motifs like this, where Demeter appears to be feeding Pore a mushroom, which, I mean, that doesn't work for the Claviceps purpurea idea, because if you remember what that one looked like, it was a funny, scraggly looking thing. It doesn't really look like a mushroom. You know, it does, but that's, you know, if you consider this is a cereal grain, like this is a rye grain, so you would have to get really up close and personal to see that that was a classic mushroom shape. So, you know, the jury is still a little bit out as to what exactly was in the kykeon, but it was some kind of psychoactive substance at any rate. So these rites were led for 2,000 years. Like that is a significant portion of history, especially to have a female-led religious, extremely important religious ceremony. That's really amazing. So it started in Greece, which then later kind of mushed into Rome a little bit. And there were also similar rites in areas around, you know, in the Near East and especially Crete. All of these entheogenic festivals got grouped into the Dionysian cults. So Dionysus, the god of revelry and wine and all that. But the cult of Demeter is way older than the cult of Dionysus. And I've been interested with the things I've read, depending on who the author is and their stance on feminism, how they present these. Because especially a lot of the more patriarchal leaning, like Terence McKenna is a big one that comes to just off the top of my head, focuses on the Dionysus part of it. And kind of like they mention the Demeter part in the beginning, but then don't talk about it. Whereas other authors will be like, yeah, Dionysus came into it later, but Demeter was the main deity of these mysteries. So that's been interesting to read and see who kind of emphasizes what. So the end of this rite came in the Sarmatians, which are a group from the Eastern Balkans, invaded in the 2nd century and robbed and destroyed and really messed up Demeter's temple. And then in 170 AD, Marcus Aurelius, who was a pretty progressive Roman emperor, rebuilt it. But then it was finally brought to ruin by the Emperor Theodosius in 392, when he closed all the pagan sites in Rome during the Christian conversion. So this one remains a bit of a mystery as far as what exactly it was, but there's so many, lots of artistic depictions with some kind of fungal theme in there. And then the question could be raised, was it just the kykeon that was psychoactive, or were there multiple parts to this? The reason we don't know for sure, despite, you know, Greeks are pretty famous for writing like everything down, and Romans are even worse. We have like grocery lists for them. The reason we don't know a lot firsthand about it is because people could talk about going there and they could talk about what they learned or who they are now or how they changed, things like that. They were not allowed to talk about the actual rite, to the point that a really powerful general actually got executed in front of his men because he had talked about what actually happened during the rite. So it was considered culturally forbidden, not just taboo, but absolutely forbidden to talk about what actually happened. So that's where we're at with that. We're not, you know, we don't know exactly what it is or exactly what happened, but the current forerunners for what was in the kykeon are either Claviceps purpurea or some kind of psychoactive something. I lean towards the ergot fungus personally, again, just because it was a drink that seemed to be the thing that sparked off the greater ecstasies. So I would lean towards the ergot fungus for that. Does anyone have questions on that one before we head a little closer in history to the witch crazes. No questions on that one? All right. The witch crazes are also near and dear to my heart. I tend to do talks on the European witch crazes. I should say I don't call them witch hunts because hunts involve organization, and they were just fervor, and yeah, so I call them crazes. So to kind of set the stage for mycology of the time, this is the cover-ish art, not the cover art, but the first page art on Francis van Stierbeck's one of his writings, and it depicts mushroom women at the market. And Van Stierbeck was actually he was credited with writing the Theatrum Fungorum, is kind of the first mushroom field guide, the first fungal field guide that we really know of, or that was like written. And Van Stierbeck and his partner readily admit that how they got all of that knowledge was from women. It was from market women. It was from healing women. It was from just regular peasant women trying to feed their families and give their families medicine. Women provided 99% of what is in that book, but it was only allowed to be classified as some kind of science when the men wrote it. So I'm going to read, I know you guys can read this, but I'm going to read this quote from Frank Dugan in that Conspectus of World Ethnomycology. The circumscription of women's opportunities by regulation, by the danger of persecution, and by other difficulties in entering the professions virtually guaranteed that women's knowledge of fungi would be accorded the status of science only when collected, systematized, and transmitted by men. And I think that's a really important look at the origins of mycology, and honestly the origins of botany and many other sciences and medicine and many other things. That's an important piece to look at, and look at the history of these sciences while we're looking at what those sciences have discovered. It's important to take them both together like that. So in Western Europe, so we're talking France, Germany, Italy, the UK, that kind of area. The mushroom culture at this time, in 1400s to about 1700s, was pretty active. Like they used mushrooms pretty commonly. They were edible mushrooms and things like that. Even in our fairy tales, they have people picking mushrooms and stuff like that. And then even farther before that, there was possibly some entheogenic use in especially the Celtic and Germanic tribes. But what started to happen, I could give you a 2-hour lecture on the witch crazes, but just suffice it to say what started to happen with the witch crazes and the demonization of women and the demonization of natural elements, especially things that women in particular handled, which mushrooms would have been one of them, because women were the foragers, women were the garden tenders, things like that, and usually the livestock tenders, because the men were conscripted and needed to go fight for whatever lord or work in whatever field, because that's what they had to do. So the women were the ones taking care of the family and supporting everybody through these natural uses. So the attack on women's tools as well as women and women's resources really allowed for the industrialization of food supply and of healthcare, and ultimately of the population. So it allowed for more control from the ruling classes if they demonized women who could do this kind of thing, especially economic control. So this time period, the witch crazes are where we see the that fungophobic culture really sink its teeth and really take root in Western European cultures. Before that, again, there were some, tales about mushrooms and stuff that we have left, because the Celtic tribes and Germanic tribes, Welsh tribes, they really went through a pretty vicious decimation of their cultural practices. So we're missing big holes, and the Norse did too, to some extent. We're missing some pretty big holes because it was just forbidden to talk about, destroy all evidence, that kind of thing. But it's kind of like mushrooms are really hard to get rid of, fungi are really hard to get rid of, so are their stories. It's really hard to completely get rid of them. So we see little glimmers of them in certain places. So these mushroom circles, which are, this is all one, if you're not really familiar with mushrooms and how they grow, this is all one organism, and these are the fruiting bodies of the organism. So scientifically we can explain that this is, you know, these are the outskirts of this organism, and that's where the mushrooms popped up. But I mean, if you're a pre-medieval peasant and you see this pop up overnight, that's kind of a fairly interesting thing, and it deserves a story about it. So in the Celtic and Germanic, in the fairy culture and little people cultures, and like gnomes and trolls and stuff like that, these were considered portals to the other world, or portals to the world of the fae, and you were not supposed to step in them because you get transported, and you might never return from the land of the fae, or you might return years later, or return in some kind of altered state in some way, which may have been kind of the beginnings of cautionary mushroom tales, that like some mushrooms will feed you and you'll be cool and it's fine. Some mushrooms will kill you. Some mushrooms will, you know, mess with your mind a little bit. And some mushrooms won't have any effect. So that might be kind of a tale just to use caution around mushrooms in general. But during the witch craze era, we start to see these not being known as fairy circles anymore, but especially in Germany, they're called Hexenringen, which means witch rings. And it was said that here is where the witches cast their Sabbaths. This is where they had their communion with the beast, and that the mushrooms themselves were actually the seeds of Satan that he spilled upon the ground. And this demonization of especially ones like the Amanita muscaria, it likes to hang out in, or likes to grow with trees that are considered sacred to a lot of pagan cultures, especially the birch tree is really considered sacred. So using this red demonic color with the purity of that birch tree, which was already held sacred, you know, the socio-political entity that was the church was able to you know, demonize these mushrooms by saying they were hurting the birch tree in some way, which is not the case at all. They're actually they exist together very well. There is definitely, with the intensity that Amanita muscaria particularly got hit with these negative kind of news stories about them, really does indicate that there was probably some kind of entheogenic use going on, because the church wanted to switch it, wanted to, you know, have that not happen anymore. So they demonized these quite literally. So there were most narrative myths involving entheogenic mushrooms have some sort of connection with like a little spirit, or some sort of gnome, or in the Mesoamerican cultures, they're called little children. And in the Celtic and Germanic tribes, it would be called fairies or brownies or things like that. It's thought to be able to be tied perhaps to entheogenic use of Amanita muscaria. This is one that in modern witch lore, so I'm talking anybody after Aleister Crowley kind of situation, in modern witch lore, there's this idea that these were used for witches' flying ointments, which really, really bothers me, because this perpetuates this idea that there was this mass cult of witches in Europe that were controlling things and working behind the scenes for world domination. And we've heard that story many times in many different parts of history. But that's not a thing. Witches weren't a religious group then. They were just women. They were just women who fed their families and who tried to make some money outside of the accepted economic fields. So that, to me, when that gets brought up in a ethnomycology book, that to me says that author didn't do their interdisciplinary homework, because they wouldn't be saying that was a usage for this mushroom if they understood what that meant historically. So that, again, you know, brings it back to that necessity for interdisciplinary cooperation. So these mushrooms, many mushrooms, got demonized the same way they were said to be used for, you know, poisons and potions by witches, and that was definitely, if there was any holdover to entheogenic usage, that would have been the end of it. Was the church claiming that they were used for evil potions and stuff. And then there's some more mushrooms or fungi that got involved in these stories. This is the witch's butter, which is there's several tremella species. This is a specific one. And these were said to be a mark of where a witch's power fell, or where a curse misfired, or some evidence of a witch being around. And these grow like everywhere, though there's wood and water. And in northwestern Europe, pretty much everything is wood and water. So these are around in a lot of places. But to find this on somebody's house or in somebody's garden or something was a really big key for persecutors to say, oh, she's definitely a witch. This is in her garden. And then we come back to our ergot here, Claviceps purpurea, that this is connected through the witch crazes again to midwifery and the use of the ergot as a medicine, especially as a uterine stimulant. And it was used both in childbirth and as well as in abortifacient, because, you know, birth control has been happening in different kinds of ways throughout history. But midwives in particular were targeted really hard by the witch crazes. So something that they would have used definitely would have been demonized. There have been several theories of ergot infected grains being used in beers and being used in breads and things like that as a source of mass hysteria, and then as well as a source of, you know, cattle deaths and other symptoms of a witch infestation. Some of those have been debunked. I know there's a pretty common one about Salem, you know, that being the source of the mass hysteria, but I believe that one has been debunked. But it could be possible. I mean, as we've discussed, it can survive the fermentation process, and beer was safer than a lot of water. So beer was a daily rationed thing then, and could easily have been infected with something like this. So that is something that is definitely possible, though I don't know if anything has been officially verified about that. So this is the point where I like to mention that the brutality and fervor experienced during witch crazes is still creating ripples today. It set up the basis for you know, a lot of atrocities in the colonial era as well, and a lot of continued distrust of nature in our culture, and of women who work with nature, and hopefully learning a little bit more about this importance of learning about mycology and demystifying mushrooms in general, that they're not evil little devil spawns. Like, they're just fungus, and they're very helpful and wonderful things, and they're very fun to learn about, and they're very cool to interact with, and very important to our planet, as well as, you know, to our culture, as we've been learning it to all of our cultures. I'm not sure, do we have time for another one, or?
We did get a request for Australia.
Oh, that's a short one too, because there's not a lot there. But yeah, that's a perfect one to do. Australia. It's down here. So I don't know a lot of stories from Australia, because again, it's tricky. Relationships between anthropologists and the indigenous peoples are tricky. They always have been, and for a good reason. So this is one that I'm still kind of delving into, but I just have a couple little nuggets to sprinkle for you, you know, to maybe inspire you to go research as well. Mushroom use is pretty common in the indigenous Australian tribes, and many are eaten as a pretty reliable food supply. Not that one on the top, don't eat that. So there are some medicinal and quite a bit of edible use, but there are some that are considered absolutely untouchable. You do not touch these, and that's due to spiritual connections. So one of the ones that I really like, this is Omphalotus nidiformis, which is the Australian variant. The closest thing we have is probably the jack-o'-lantern mushroom. They're not perfectly related, but they do bioluminesce. This picture is enhanced a bit, but they do bioluminesce a bit, given the right conditions. They are not for eating. Those are toxic. But they were said by the Arunta peoples to be the product of fallen stars. And the falling stars were, in fact, the product of evil magic from rival shamans. So we don't touch that. We don't go anywhere near that. Don't talk about it. It's they use the word chinga, which means the spirit in a negative context. So that's one of the ones that, you know, that's a cautionary mythology. We don't touch that one because it's, you know, it was put there by bad spirits. Don't touch it. And then in other cases, there's some cool parallels with indigenous use in Northern Hemisphere, and there's a lot of mirror examples, but this one right here, the Lytoporus portentosus, its usages are really, really similar to our what we call birch polypore, which is Piptoporus betulinus or Fomitopsis betulinus, I think is the other name, which actually looks really similar to it too. We can find it all over birch trees. They're the weird little marshmallow looking things you find. But they were used to transport fire, because you can transport fire in their little in their pores. They're used as a anti-parasitic, and they actually have antiseptic properties as well. And you can peel off that bottom living pore layer, and you can use it as a bandage dressing, which is kind of neat. They're not like edible. They're horrifically bitter and really chewy, so you don't want to eat them. But they're used for medicines, both you know, our birch polypore and these polypores from Australia. So that was, especially in a place as biologically unique as Australia, I think it's really cool to see you know, crossovers like that. It's really neat. The one story that I found is another really good echoing story. I didn't find the whole story, but I found what it was about. In the Northwest Australian tribes, there's these brothers called the Begajambiri brothers, and they're two dingo brothers, but they get up to a lot of nonsense like Raven does in the Haida mythologies. And these are two dingo gods who were born out of the holes in the earth, and they had, you know, they had adventures, they created lots of things, they named lots of things. They're a lot like the character of Raven. And again, in their story, the first humans were created without genitalia, without a way to produce or entertain each other. And the Begajambiri brothers experimented with different fungi until they found the right fungi that fit for human genitalia. I thought that was just so specific of a crossover. That was really, really neat to find out about. So that's really all I have in Australia. I definitely need to do more research in there, and I will continue to do so. And I would also urge you to, you know, see what you can find from the Indigenous Australian usages. I see we have a little thing in the chat. Yes. Any last questions at all? You can feel free to come on mute now if you want and physically ask them.
Sonia, I just want to take this opportunity to thank you. I really appreciate your approach towards sharing these cultural stories that you know, is responsible and important. I think this is really fascinating, but also a unique perspective that we don't often see in this community. So I've really enjoyed this. Thank you very much. I have a few minutes for questions, which can be shared in the chat, or like she said, feel free to unmute yourself and ask verbally. I have a couple minutes here.
Again, if you're interested in looking up more about mycomythology and ethnomycology in general, I would really encourage you to try to go after some scholarly articles written and published, you know, through scientific journals, anthropological journals, through universities and things like that. Which, I mean, we've been talking about this whole time that it's not a perfect medium, but honestly, the peer-reviewed articles are the best thing we have right now. But the very best would be to, you know, physically hear it from somebody who lives that culture would be the very best. I shy away from a lot of the popular published works because you can find cool tidbits and stuff, but you really have to take a lot of those with a big grain of salt and understand confirmation biases and things like that, and understand the author's biases. It's really important, and their background and everything.
Well, I have a question. And I understand that I'm coming from this contemporary view where we want to categorize every living organism and, you know, taxonomy. Is there any evidence or hints towards an understanding in these traditional cultures that fungi are, you know, different from plants? They're not human. Understanding that within the cultural context still.
Yeah, I think there's a few cases where they're like, well, they're not animals, but they're definitely not plants. I think for sure in the Pacific Northwest, absolutely, there is something other. They know they're not part of the tree. They know they're a different thing, and are serving a different purpose. And then we didn't get into soma, which, because I'm iffy on that, but there's some parts of the Rig Vedas, which are, you know, one of the first written religious texts from India, that talks about, you know, they call it like a plant without a flower or roots, or they kind of say it's a plant, but say it kind of isn't. That they're not sure if how exactly to fit it in there. So there's definitely this understanding that they're not a plant, but they weren't sure what they were. And then it actually wasn't that long ago that we found out that where living organisms split, fungi are actually a lot closer to animals than they are to plants, which is why it's so hard for us to treat fungal infections, because we're, you know, damaging human tissue or animal tissue as well when we damage fungal tissue. So yeah, there's definitely hints about it, but I can't think off the top of my head anything hardcore that would say this is definitely something different. But there was this vague conception that this isn't quite the same.
Right. Great, thank you. Yeah, there's certainly area to dig back into past knowledge that we had, so that's really exciting to study too.